Hello. So, we are about to dive into complete and utter insanity and the misinformation. So, without further ado, let's take a look at Tucker Carlson's interview with one Daryl Cooper and see what's going on here. Why is everyone talking about Tucker Carlson like he interviewed a Nazi? Let's find out.
The big tech companies censor our content. I hate to tell you that it's still going on in 2024, but you know what they can't censor? Live events. And that's why we are hitting the road on a fall tour for the entire month of September, coast to coast. We will be in cities across the United States. We'll be in Phoenix with Russell Brand, Anaheim, California with Vivek Ramaswamy, Colorado Springs with Tulsi Gabbard, Salt Lake City with Glenn Beck, Tulsa, Oklahoma with Dan Bongino, Kansas City with Megyn Kelly, Wichita with Charlie Kirk, Milwaukee with Larry Elder, Rosenberg, Texas with Jesse Kelly, Grand Rapids with Kid Rock, Hershey, Pennsylvania with J.D. Vance, Reading, Pennsylvania with Alex Jones, Fort Worth, Texas with Roseanne Barr.
Oh my god. You're just doing like just every single worst person, but not like normal worst people, like worst people as in like they're completely untethered from reality and the worst, you know?
Greenville, South Carolina with Marjorie Taylor Greene, Sunrise, Florida with John Rich, Jacksonville, Florida with Donald Trump Jr.
I rest my case.
You can get tickets at tuckercarlson.com. Hope to see you there. So sometimes I think to myself, like, why are current events so unclear to so many people? And I always go back to the question of history. You can't really understand what's happening right now unless you understand what has happened before. You certainly can't plan a coherent future unless you understand. And then I think, well, why do people know so little about history? Probably because it's not taught. And then to the extent that it is taught in, say, airport bookstores.
Yeah, airport bookstores, the main place of learning in America.
Our popular historians are people like John Meacham and Michael Beschloss and Doris Kearns Goodwin and Anne Applebaum. Not only sort of the dumbest people in the country, I would say, I know most of them, but also completely dishonest political actors. And so I think I can tell that you hate compliments, but I just want to say, I think you are the most important popular historian working in the United States today. You work in a different medium on Substack X podcasts, but I'm a fan of yours because of the way you treat history, which,
to be clear, I do want you all to know who this guy is before we really get into this. Daryl Cooper is just a neo-Nazi. Just straight up a neo-Nazi. He denies the Holocaust, claims that the reason so many Jews died in the Holocaust was not because of an intentional effort on the part of the Germans, but rather just a big old whoopsie daisy. They just weren't prepared to feed that many people, and so they all starved to death. You know how it is. You just do a little whoopsie daisy and 6 million people die. But he also doesn't believe that 6 million people died, so, guess it might be easier for him to rationalize in that way. And also want to point out that there's a historian named Niall Ferguson, and he's actually like he writes history books and like teaches and does all that stuff, right? He's talked about Daryl Cooper and has pointed out that Daryl Cooper hasn't ever written a historical work. And in fact, he describes Daryl Cooper's work as anti-history because it is so inaccurate that it is actively attempting to undo the work of other historians. And yeah, he has a long history of defending the Nazis.
is with relentless curiosity and honesty, and I'm sure you have all kinds of political beliefs or religious beliefs or whatever, but I feel like you get to what you think is true based on really intense research. So for those people who aren't familiar with who you are, I want people to know who you are, and I want you to be widely recognized as the most important historian in the United States because I think that you are. So that's my last compliment for our time together. I know it was excruciating. Tell us some of the story.
I do have to say straight up, I do not know that I have the fortitude to sit through over 2 hours of this. But whenever we're going until I run out of juice, okay, on this segment.
stories, we call them stories, but historical events that you have taken a really close look at recently.
So I decided to start with an easy one. I did a 26-hour series on the early history of Zionism and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Whether that was naivety or hubris, it turned out pretty well.
Yes.
And the reason it turned out well, I think, and I've had time to really think about it over the years. I started it in 2015. Took me a few years to complete, but I've received hundreds of emails from Israelis, from Jews around the world who are
Why was that funny? Because Tucker Carlson isn't being a person right now. He's trying to project a certain view of himself into the world. It's why he's palling around with Alex Jones. He's just trying to become the next Alex Jones.
you know, boosters of Israel, as well as Palestinians and people around the Middle East and people who are critical of Israel, who all of them on all sides have kind of told me that it at least opened up their perspective to the way the other side saw the world,
Yeah.
which is what I
It's
was
true. It is evil Hank Green.
going for. In all of my series, something that I didn't really.
I think that what the series that you did on the formation of Israel, I think, is regarded by honest people as the most honest, most non-aligned look. No axes were being ground, maybe ever done. Can you just
You know, I do want to just, as a general rule of thumb, if you are watching something like this and someone just keeps going over and over again, oh, you're so unbiased, you're so unbiased. I think it's so cool how completely and utterly lacking in bias you are. Just no bias whatsoever. I just think that's so cool. That like maybe you should take that with like all the salt that exists in the universe, okay? Like maybe that should be the biggest red flag you can possibly imagine. Like usually if something is an unbiased source of information, people don't need to fillet it, okay?
just tell people who aren't familiar that what did it take to produce that? You said it took a few years, but what did you do in preparation for it?
Well, it's funny actually, because when I first started it, I didn't really know what went into making a podcast like that, right? So I had this experience where I started working on it after I had read maybe like 6 books, because the series only goes up to 1948. I did some follow-up work on the more modern period, but this is up to the foundation of the state of Israel and the lead up to that, right? I only covered that part. And so I didn't.
Also, yeah, Niall Ferguson is criticizing him. And for those of you who don't know who Niall Ferguson is, he's considered a very conservative historian. When Niall Ferguson is like pointing at someone and being like, "This guy's a Nazi," do you understand how high of a bar you have to meet for someone like that to call someone a Nazi? Like Ferguson is like a guy who goes on like the Rubin Report. Like he's not even like a moderate conservative. He's just a very very conservative guy.
Know if this was going to be a 1-episode thing, a 2-episode thing. I start working on it after I've read about 6 books on that pre-1948 period. And I'm working on it for maybe, quite a while, taking my time, because I was working for the Department of Defense at the time. So it was, a side gig, and it wasn't even a gig. I didn't make any money from it. And after a while, when I started to approach
You worked for the Department of Defense for free? What's wrong with you?
the end of that episode, this is months and months and months later. By now I've read 20 books, 30 books about that pre-1948 period, and a lot of the tangential topics and issues that help you better understand it.
Also, let me put it this way. I feel like if you're just saying, I read a lot of books on this, that's not really telling us anything, because the books you might have read on this might have been shit books. You might have been reading like really bad, uninformative books, and you might have been reading them from sussy sources. And who did you read? Who was informative of your ideas on this time period and this place? What were their arguments? What narratives, what evidence did you find compelling? Use specifics. And the fact that he's just talking in vague generalities is really, well, let me put it this way. They stop counting the number of books you're reading in school sometime in maybe early middle school. That stops being impressive. And I feel like that's kind of where this guy exists intellectually.
And I went back and I started going over what I'd created for that first episode. And it was so embarrassingly terrible, where you look at it and you're like, this is not even, that phrase, not even wrong. It's like, this is not even, it was a nightmare to read. And you realize, and I realized something at that point. I was like, I'd read 6 books on this topic. 6 books is a lot, on a single historical topic. There's countless topics that I've read a book or 2 on. And if you give me like an energy drink and let me go, I'll start pontificating for hours about it,
Oh, I know the feeling.
Yeah. This segment of the podcast is titled The History of Israel Palestine. And he's been talking for like the last 5 minutes about, I read a lot of books on it.
I read a book on the Federal Reserve once.
And so eventually I got to the point, I counted them all up one time. People keep asking me to put together a list. I can't put together a complete one because I just didn't keep as good a track as I should. But I read over 80 whole books, parts of another 100 at least. And about, when I counted them up, I could remember about like 1,300 academic papers and journal. I read everything I could find.
Okay, so only people in prison read 80 books.
Yeah. Well, or people who work for the Department of Defense and their job entails spending 8 to 10 months a year going overseas by yourself, often with nothing to do in a country that nobody speaks your language. So, I would go over to work with one of our foreign allies, usually on the weapon systems that I specialized in. We'd go over there and we'd work during the day. Most of the Ministry of Defense people, it doesn't matter what country you go to. You can go to Israel, you can go to Norway, you can go to Japan, Korea. All they want to talk about is American gun culture. It's their obsessed with.
Yeah, Velvet, this is such a weird opening to this podcast. Just talk about something, please.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. And
Is that, are you knowledgeable on that topic?
I wouldn't say I'm necessarily like technically knowledgeable, like my gun
I feel like that really encapsulates what we're getting into here.
nut friends are, but yeah, in terms of, I'm a hunter and gun owner, educated gun owner, but I have friends who are real gun nuts that I refer
that's totally
to
fair.
Yeah.
Right. It's all specs and
I say that with all affection when, that's, and so, I would go overseas and spend my work day working with them, training them, helping them with, whatever was broken or needed upgrading, whatever we were doing over there. And sometimes I would spend, like I said, 8 to 10 months a year overseas. I would be doing this by myself most of the time. And so after the workday was done, it's just me in my hotel with nothing really to do. And, when I was growing up, I counted these up one time, and it was between kindergarten and 12th grade. I went to like 35 different schools. Like I was changing schools sometimes every few months.
Not a good sign. Sorry.
Yeah. Well,
What, Tucker, what does that mean? What do you mean it's not a good sign? You're talking to the product of that. Are you just are you backhanding him verbally this entire time? What is this?
One of the good habits I picked up from it was reading, because it gave, books were what gave me a sense of continuity from environment to environment to environment, right? I'm in the middle of a book and I move to another school and I have to adjust to that, but I'm still reading this book and it sort of patches me over. And that became sort of the background reality of my life as, I sort of moved around in this unpredictable way, like for most of my early years. I'd still have this thread that was coherent that I was following, consistently. And so
I don't think he was saying that he read 80 books total in his life. I think he was saying he read 80 books on specifically the topic that this segment is supposed to be about, which is the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which hasn't been addressed at all. And there is like 4 minutes left in this. So I'm really looking forward to learning about the entire history of the Israel-Palestine conflict in 4 minutes.
It definitely helped with a sense of stability like that. And it implanted this idea that, like I take refuge in books.
The book he read before Chan recommendations.
If I'm anxious, a lot of people, if they're anxious, they can't sit down and read a book because they can't sit still. Books make my anxiety go away, right? It's what they do for me. And so, I'm just a nerd is what I'm saying, basically, right? I'm a nerd. And I had a lot of time to read books. And once I started really getting obsessed with the podcast, it got to the point where I was waking up 3 hours early so that I could read and write and work on the podcast. If I was in a meeting and we were waiting for the next speaker to come in, I was working on the podcast. Lunch, I was working on the podcast. Evening, I was working on the podcast. And I mean, became like a real obsession, partly because, I mean, left to my own devices, I would read books and talk to people about them. That's, you know, if I had $1 trillion and nothing to do with myself, I would want a whole library and a bunch of interesting people to talk to about these books. That's what I'd do anyway, right? And so it was never really work. But yeah, that's the way you do it. You know, people who want to do, there's a lot of people I know who started doing history podcasts or other, maybe not history, but not sort of conversational, just back and forth discussion podcasts where they do research and they want to make a presentation, right? And a lot of these guys who started back when I started, 2015, 2016. And, you know, my success up to this point has been kind of unique in the space. Not everybody wants to listen to a 7-hour podcast on Jim Jones. And by the way, that's only the 5th out of 7 episodes on the topic, right? So that's not for everybody. And, you know, they ask me sometimes, like, how can I do this as well as you do it? And other people who are like aspiring podcasters have asked me that. And like you said, I don't like compliments. And so I get shy when people ask me things like that, but I tell them, and you're going to object to this because you're a nice fellow and everything. But like, I'm not that smart. It's nothing like that. I work on this. You have to if you want to do something like this, you have to be willing to get up a little early, to use your lunch hour, you got to spend time in books. You got to read. And then when you think you've read enough, you got to read some more. And because there's so much out there. Like I said, that experience after I had read 6 books on just the pre-1948 period of, you know, the Zionist Israeli Palestinian.
Yeah, that's so cool. Tell us what you learned.
Conflict story. And I knew nothing. I knew nothing. Like embarrassingly nothing. Worse than nothing. Because like at least before I read
the illusion of knowledge.
Yeah, at least before I had read the books, I would just be repeating to you whatever I had heard, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu say or somebody like on TV. I at least would have just been repeating that. This was worse. This was like the full midwit kind of meme, in production where you know enough to really embarrass yourself. And I'm glad that I sort of recognized that at the time, and I went back and like scrapped the whole thing. Didn't start it for another year after that, probably, because I just realized that
we are now 12 minutes in, and all he's been talking about this entire time is he reads books.
You know, I got to get deeper into this. And as I've moved through,
yeah, he hasn't even told us the name of like one of the books.
Different topics over the years. Because I don't do an Israel-Palestine podcast. I do a history podcast, and I choose topics based on what I want to read about. You know, that's all it is. Like usually while I'm working on one. Something as I'm sort of getting into the second half, finishing it up, I can see the finish line on the thing I'm working on now. It'll get harder and harder to discipline myself to stay on that topic because there's something that's pulling me away.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, and so it's like a feeling of relief where like I finish it and now I already know the next topic because it just emerged kind of naturally. And I move on to that. And sometimes they're very, very different. I've done, like I said, a 32-hour series on the Jonestown cult, which turned into, you say, how do you do 32 hours on that? I told the story of the
32 hours.
Yeah, well, the reason for that, and I didn't know this going in. I never know exactly how this is going to unfold when I'm going in. Unless it's like sometimes I'll do a single episode and I kind of know the story. But when I start a long series, it's going to take me a year and a half to put out every episode. I don't necessarily know how it's going to turn out.
Okay, I have to be completely honest here. I do not care about his thoughts on Jonestown. I think we can skip that. But most of this is on World War II, and let's check that out instead. Let's just skip to that.
Hey, right now, I'm really interested in the project that you're working on now. I'm a little bit baffled by it, so I'm just going to answer my own question. So you were working on World War II, which has to be, even more than the Kennedy assassination, the most written about event in human history. I can't think of one that has occasional books. So why World War II?
Well, I was giving a talk to a graduate history class at the University of Vienna a while back online, giving them a talk. And one of the things I said to them, and I was curious how this was going to go over in Austria, but it seemed to go over all right, is I told them over the next few decades, like, look, anytime you have a historical event, for us in the United States, it's the Civil Rights Movement, it's World War II, and to a certain degree, it's still the Civil War. Everything in between and before those things, you can do whatever you want. Doesn't matter. You think that the Russians were to blame for World War I and not the Germans. You think that it was all British conspiracy. You can do whatever you want. It's fine. Because that's not part of the founding mythology of the order that we're all living in at this time, right? Those other things are. And whenever you have a historical event that is mythologized, and when I say that, I don't mean myth like that's a myth, that's a lie. That's not what I mean. I mean that it's...
Is this too fast? I'll slow it a little bit down.
It's a formative part of how we all understand the world we're in, or at least officially, like the official world. Like
the structures we live in.
It's the justification for a lot of those structures, right? Whenever you have those things, you're going to have taboos. You're going to have certain ways that certain topics have to be.
You know, he's talking about two different things, though. On the one hand, you have history, right? Like the truthful, as best as we can get, account of things that happened, right? And on the other hand, he's talking about like the cultural narrative. These are two different things, you know, like they don't necessarily align with one another.
Be talked about that are going to guarantee that topic is just profoundly misunderstood. And I told the students at the University of Vienna, I said, over the next couple of decades, like we're going to get to a point where the interwar period and the Second World War are far enough away that people can actually start taking a more honest look at everything that went on. And it is going to be the most fruitful place that any aspiring historian can dive into, because we spent the last 70 years, I mean, in Europe's case, like literally throwing people in jail for looking into the wrong corners, right? So,
which people were being thrown in jail? I wonder. What kinds of people were being thrown in jail for asking the wrong questions? What questions were they asking? Just out of curiosity. Because really the only laws that I'm aware of regarding this are laws against like Holocaust denial. And the people who are violating those laws are neo-Nazis. This dude is literally sitting there and saying, yeah, I think as more time goes by, there will be more people who look into World War II and realize the Holocaust didn't happen. Like, that's what he's trying to say. He's trying to say that his propaganda will get better in the future as like this recedes from living memory. Scum like him gets put in prison. Yeah, it's true.
So there's and even
particularly in Austria.
Right. And so even in the United
States, it was an invaded country.
Particularly in Austria, yeah, and in Germany, it's weird. Let's not examine why that is.
So I'm not exactly sure why it's so important.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
it's a big topic, but I mean, even the United States, where
just two Nazi pals palling around.
Not going to go to jail necessarily for doing that. You might have your life ruined and lose your job.
You might absolutely go to jail in this country.
Nowadays, you might, yeah. But
are you serious? Because like no one in America is being thrown in jail just for being a Nazi or believing in Nazi things. You get thrown in jail for those things if you then like I don't know, like assault a black person or like a Jewish person, you know, because hate crime charges do exist. You know, like when once you start acting on your Nazi principles, yeah, you get harsher prison sentences. Yeah.
You know, you could write a book. You could take any angle on it you want. You're not going to ever get a job or have a publisher want to publish anything, but you could do it. You can go out on.
Oh, is that why you've never published any historical works? Is that the reason? Weird.
The street corner and stand on a box and say whatever it is you think. But even still, you know, that event is really it's such a core part of the state religion that there are emotional triggers built into people since childhood that almost prevent them from taking an approach that might lead them to information or to conclusions that are not part of the state religion's version of that event. You know, and again, you're going to find that. I'm sure the Peloponnesian Wars were like that for the ancient Greeks.
Well, by the way, the American Revolution, which is now totally
Yeah. The Peloponnesian War, famous for its mass genocide. Yeah. Short. Yeah, like a couple generations later, people were saying that genocide didn't happen, and here we are. No, they're not the same, bro. Goodness.
Relevant to modern America, unfortunately, was like that. The life of Lincoln was like that. Lincoln was an very complicated guy. It's not an endorsement of slavery. Well, speaking for myself, I think slavery is disgusting. It's the worst thing. What you're saying is absolutely right. It's not just the Second World War that is sort of uniquely censored or protected. The mythology around it, it's every event that's central to a nation's understanding of itself, and then that changes over time. So do you think that we are far enough away, 80 years from that war, where you can try to take as an objective a look as you can, and that will be allowed?
No, I don't. I think we've got a little ways to go on that, but I hope I can kind of start to break the ice a little bit, you know, because like here's the problem with doing something like that. And this is something I'm very aware of as I research it and start to work on the project, is that when you have a mythologized historical event that is told, that is, I mean, again, you go to a lot of places in Europe, it's a legal requirement. Over here, it's not quite that, but it almost might as well be where that this event is going to be described from a certain perspective. You're going to approach it a certain way. There's just certain things you're not allowed to question. You have to...
Like, literally, it's a crime to ask questions,
right.
Yes.
No, it's not, actually. My God.
Then whenever that's the case, when you try to add any type of balance to that account, when you try to tell the story in a way that brings other approaches and other perspectives into it, it's going to look like you're trying to justify those other things. That's just how it's going to seem to people who are very locked into this side. And so if you start talking about the interwar period and how the Weimar culture, you know, after the First World War led to something like the rise of the National Socialists, and why...
Did it though? Did the culture of the Weimar Republic create the National Socialists? Did the existence of gay people create homophobic bigots? Is that what we're going with here?
The people who embraced that movement did embrace it in a way that's not just, you know, was because they were, you know, this country, Germany, a sophisticated cultural, superpower that was fine. And then they all turned into demons for a few years and now they're fine again. Like that's sort of the official story. And I think deep down, we all know that makes no sense. Everything.
It does make sense because people have the capacity to turn into demons. Like not literally demons, but like, you know, have like insane moral and religious justification for heinous acts. We see that all the time. You know, we see it in Bosnia, we see it in Rwanda, we see it we see it all over. People have the capacity to do bad things. That's not new information.
Has a cause. You know, again, to go back, like Uday Hussein got to be Uday Hussein from that 3-year-old little kid. Jim Jones got to be Jim Jones from being that guy who was just an earnest local Indianapolis civil rights activist. They all got to be those people that led to the chaos that they eventually invited into the world and onto themselves and their people through their experiences in the world and through a series of decisions.
Yeah, people live in a society. We sure do live in a society.
Decision points that at the time, if you can bring yourself to step into the shoes of those people, And it's not a comfortable thing to do. I mean, I literally listened to probably 2,000 hours of Jim Jones's sermons and him screaming at his people and just going insane to the point where I was dreaming about this guy for months. I would have my headphones in as I was working, listening to Jim Jones. And it's really hard. Yeah, I know.
Are you the only guy in the office doing that?
I think I'm probably the only person in the world that's done that. And so like, and I got to the point where I felt like I knew this guy. I could notice from tape to tape, I would hear changes in his tone of voice. And I knew whether he was high on amphetamines that day or if he had taken his barbiturates already. And now I felt like I knew this guy. And their tapes, by the way, they're not all from like 1 year. They're from like 15, 20 years, right? So you can watch this process of a descent into madness as it's happening.
Yeah.
And, to get to a point where you can bring yourself to step into the shoes of any other human being and understand that as much as it makes you uncomfortable, it is just a human being. And at the very, very like base level, their motivations are the same as yours. Their needs are the same as yours. But that we're a multivariate species that can go a lot of different directions, right? And to be able to do that and force yourself to do it is the key. And so when you do something like that with, again, like a historical event like World War II, where, the one rule is that you shall not do that. You shall not.
No one is saying this. So, like, the thing that he's running into here, and that I want to inoculate all of you against, is that he's trying to say that no historian is allowed to ask questions or think about how did the Nazis feel? How did the everyday average Nazi feel? How did they become radicalized? That's like the main thrust of like World War II, like historical inquiry. Like that's one of the things historians are most interested about when it comes to World War II. How did an entire country of people go that bananas? What forces were at play? How did people like come to be in their situation? How did they come to be part of the war effort? What caused some people to support the war effort, or some people to become super believers in like the war and become like members of the SS? What caused some people to reject it and become like an underground network for resistance fighters or Jewish refugees? What caused some people to outright attempt assassinations on the German regime? That's like one of the things historians are most interested in. And this guy's saying, oh yeah, they don't want you to look in it. You're not allowed to have any inquiry into that. And like, if you know anything about this time period, if you know shit about Dick, okay, you know that's just not true.
Look at this topic and try to understand how the Germans saw the world, like how the whole thing from the First World War on up to the very end of the war, how these people might have genuinely felt like they were the ones under attack, that they were the ones being victimized by their neighbors and by all these by the Allied powers, and you can handle that with a sentence. You can wave it off and say, well, they're justifying themselves or they're rationalizing their evil or whatever you want to say. But again, I think we're getting to the point where that's very unsatisfying for people.
Most of us.
Well, it's not, it might be unsatisfying for people, but yeah, when you build up an intense propaganda effort to like isolate your population and feed them party lines, and then you enforce that violently, and also have a united enemy against which to direct the public, it becomes suddenly you're providing people the framework for the kind of hatred you want to perpetuate your regime. It's a deliberate effort to cultivate these ideas and belief systems in the general population. It's complicated, but it also, yeah, it is kind of like that. You got people on board with it because you told them, hey, actually it is okay to be hateful towards X group of people. Skip the Tucker Carlson ad read.
Shallow, of course.
Hold on, sorry to interrupt, but that's true. But every society has founding myths.
100%.
And you need them. Like I don't think that we're necessarily better off now that people are able to just freely tear down a statue of George Washington because he was a slave owner, right?
Agree.
And so like there are sacred symbols and national myths that any group of people are going to need to hold themselves together.
And there's also peril in knowing the truth about things. I mean, if
it's so interesting that like he's talking about like, oh yeah, pulling down the myths around World War II, that's gonna be the best position to have in the next like 80 years as a historian. But don't you dare do that to George Washington or the founding fathers.
when we finally find out how President Kennedy was murdered in 1963, we finally find out what all these weird lights in the sky are at night. When we really get to the truth of that, will we be better off or not? I mean, those are fair questions. I don't know the answer.
Again, Tucker Carlson's trying so hard to be Alex Jones. So yeah, when we finally find out what the lights in the sky are, will we be better off? Because aliens.
But let me just say what I completely agree with you. Particularly any unifying myth, is important.
He does mean
I'm
UFOs.
just
yes.
highly
Yeah, he's talking about aliens.
distressed by the uses to which the myths about World War II have been put in the context of modern foreign policy, particularly the war in Ukraine. But not just the war in Ukraine, so many others. Churchill's the good guy, Neville Chamberlain's the bad guy. It's too pat. It's obviously quite banal, but it also has justified like the killing of millions of people since the end of the second.
I mean, it is a bit pat and like very simplistic, but yeah, people tend to believe that Winston Churchill is the good guy and Neville Chamberlain was the bad guy. And what's the reality? Well, the reality is that Winston Churchill was a very, very bad guy who let millions of people die, and Neville Chamberlain was immensely ineffective in his role. Like, he was hated because appeasement didn't work.
Second World War. And so I do think it's fair to ask, like, what really was going on? So, for example, and I'm American, I'm not English, so I don't have any weird motive in asking this, but how would you assess Winston Churchill?
I got in trouble with my podcast partner, Jocko Willink, one time because he's a New England Dutchman whose his family, it's near and dear to they're Dutch, but very near and dear to their heart that Winston Churchill is a hero, right?
Well, everyone
thinks that. He really thinks that. And I told him that I think, and maybe I'm being a little hyperbolic, maybe, but I told him.
Something tells me, though, that this guy dislikes Churchill because he fought Nazis and not because Churchill, like, started the Bengal famine and killed, like, millions of people in India.
Maybe trying to provoke him a little bit, that I thought Churchill was the chief villain of the Second World War. Now, he didn't kill the most people. He didn't commit the most atrocities. But I believe, and I don't really think, I think when you really get into it and tell the story right and don't leave anything out, you see that he was primarily responsible for that war becoming what it did, becoming something other than an invasion of Poland. Or
yeah, I don't think that was on Churchill, but I don't think the Blitzkrieg was Churchill's fault. Like, what do you? I don't think that was a whoopsie daisy on Winston Churchill.
At every step of the way, like, people are very often, I find, surprised to learn. There's a two-step process.
Well,
right?
why don't you make the case for that? Okay, so you've made your statement. A lot of people are thinking, well, wait a second. You said Churchill, my childhood hero, the guy with the cigar.
Yeah. Well, and the next thought that comes into their head is that, oh, you're saying Churchill was the chief villain, therefore his enemies, Adolf Hitler and so forth, were
Stalin,
the protagonists, right?
Yeah.
They're the good guys if you think he's a villain. That's not the case. That's not what I'm saying. Germany, look, they put themselves into a position, and Adolf Hitler is chiefly responsible for this, but his whole regime is responsible for it, that when they went into the East,
I love that this guy's like, Adolf Hitler was chiefly responsible for it, but it was the whole regime, really. Like, oh man, dude.
1941, they launched a war where they were completely unprepared to deal with the millions and millions of prisoners of war, of local political prisoners and so forth that they were going to have to handle. They went in with no plan for that. And they just threw these people into camps, and millions of people ended up dead there. You have like letters as early as July, August 1941 from commandants of these makeshift camps that they're setting up for these millions of people who are surrendering or people they're rounding up. And so it's 2 months.
Or people they're rounding up? What was that? Just some people they were rounding up? I'm so curious about that.
It's a month or two after Barbarossa was launched. And they're writing back to the high command in Berlin saying, we can't feed these people. We don't have the food to feed these people. And one of them actually says, rather than wait for them all to slowly starve this winter, wouldn't it be more humane to just finish them off quickly now? And so this is like 2 months into the invasion, right? And like my view on this, I argue with my Zionist interlocutors about this all the time with regard to the current war in Gaza. Look, man, like maybe you, as the Germans, you felt like you had to invade to the east. Maybe you thought that Stalin was such a threat, or that if he launched a surprise attack and seized the oil fields in Romania, that you would now not have the fuel to actually respond, and you'd be crippled, and all of Europe would be under threat, and whatever it was, that like maybe you thought you had to do that. But at the end of the day, you launched that war with no plan to care for the millions and millions of civilians and prisoners of war that were going to come under your control. And
yeah, because the plan was to kill them. It wasn't an oversight. The plan was just to kill them. Like, I don't understand what's complicated about this for you. The reason the logistical supply lines to feed them didn't exist was because the plan was to kill them.
Millions of people died because of that, right? And you can look at it and say like, well, yeah. So get back to your main question about Churchill.
By the way, I haven't seen any clips from this, so it's kind of wild to me that like apropos of nothing, this guy just like veered off of talking about Winston Churchill and how Winston Churchill is to blame for Hitler invading the rest of Europe. Out of nowhere, just veers into like Holocaust denial for no reason.
If you go to 1939, when the Germans and the Soviet Union invade Poland, as soon as that war's wrapped up on the German side, Hitler starts firing off peace proposals to Britain and France because they'd already declared war. He didn't expect them to declare war, actually. Like, there's a famous scene where he kind of throws a fit when he finds out that they did do that. And so he doesn't want to fight France. He doesn't want to fight Britain. He feels that's going to weaken Europe when we've got this huge threat to the east, the communist threat over there. And he starts firing off peace proposals. He says, let's not do this. Like, we can't do this. And of course, year goes by, 1940 comes around, and they're still at war. And so he launches his invasion to the west, takes over France, takes over Western and Northern Europe. Once that's done, the British have, escaped at Dunkirk. There's no British force left on the continent. There's no opposing force left on the continent.
Now, I want to say that he at no point here showed that Winston Churchill was to blame for Hitler going beyond Poland. Notice how, like, even in his telling, like, Hitler clearly wanted to go east. But also, just want to throw this out there, Hitler thought at one point that England and France would willingly join him and like not resist him, because he viewed both countries as being not Aryan, but like lesser Aryan, but like still kind of like we can work together. They can have their own countries. Like in a eugenicist way, they were like subhuman, but like acceptable levels of subhuman to like fraternize with. And yeah, that part's true. He did think that like the eugenicist racial bond they shared would like unite them in battle or something like that.
In other words, the war is over and the Germans won. Okay.
But by what point?
Fall of 1940, right? So there's literally no opposing force on the continent. And throughout that summer, Adolf Hitler is firing off radio broadcasts, giving speeches, literally sending planes over to drop leaflets over London and other British cities, trying to get the message to these people that Germany does not want to fight you. Like, we don't want to fight you. Offering peace proposals that, it said, you keep all your overseas colonies. We don't want any of that. We want Britain to be strong. The world needs Britain to be strong, especially as we face this communist threat and so forth. Like, this what's going on. And I think that if there were people in Britain who, if they hadn't put it this way, if they hadn't been so successful at delegitimizing the peace approach by demonizing Neville Chamberlain and so forth, and holding him responsible for the invasion of Poland, that people would have been, they would have understood, like, we don't need a repeat of the First World War. We don't, which is not what ended up happening.
I mean, when you invade Poland, that's kind of what you do, though, right? Like, they had treaties and like diplomatic relationships with Poland, and like it turned out that like, hey, this guy's full of shit on this in particular, to a degree that it's actually kind of incredible.
Happening, but that's what everybody thought was going to happen. And so
what's the guest name? Daryl Cooper. He is considered a Nazi historian.
I mean, you have a guy,
and by that I don't mean like a historian that specializes in Nazis. I mean a neo-Nazi who LARPs as a historian.
When Churchill wanted a war, he wanted to fight Germany, and the reason that I don't begrudge him that. People can, national leaders, you can fight whoever you want. If you feel like your the long-term interests of the British Empire are threatened by the rise of a powerful continental power like Germany, and you need to check that those are great power games, and you play them the way you feel like you need to play them. That's fine. The reason I resent Churchill so much for it is that he kept this war going when he had no way to go back and fight this war. All he had were bombers. He was literally, by 1940, sending firebomb fleets.
I have heard more recent historians say Chamberlain was secretly stalling so they could build their air force. Still not great, but more understandable reason for appeasement. Timeline had a great doc on this perspective.
I don't really buy that about Chamberlain. Let me put it this way. I think that feels and smells to me. Not seeing any of their evidence, obviously. Like, I could be wrong, but that feels like kind of a post hoc explanation of his behavior and decision making that I don't know is backed up by the actual historical data we have. Maybe there's evidence that exists that shows me that I could be wrong, but I haven't seen that. So until I actually see that, I that feels like just like a, well, maybe he wasn't a dipshit, and maybe he was actually doing 4D chess, and I need to see the chessboard, you know?
Bomber fleets to go firebomb the Black Forest, just to burn down sections of the Black Forest, just rank terrorism, you know, going through and starting to, you know, what eventually became just the carpet bombing, saturation bombing of civilian neighborhoods, you know, to kill, is the purpose of which was to kill as many civilians as possible. And all the men were out in the field, all the fighting age men were out in the field. And so it's old people, it's women and children, and they knew that, and they were wiping these places out. It was as gigantic scaled terrorist attacks, the greatest, you know, scale.
You know, like, one of the major flaws with his narrative that he's trying to spin here is that France and England had pledged to come to Poland's aid if Germany invaded them. So there was already a defensive alliance set up. So it's not like the invasion happened and then like France and England were like, oh, well, we should be chill about it because no one wants a repeat of World War I. No, they had pledged to come to Poland's aid, and like in geopolitics, that's important to do. You know, you need to be a dependable ally.
Scale of terrorist attacks you've ever seen in world history.
Why would he do that?
Because it was the only means that they had to continue fighting at the time. You know, they didn't have the ability to reinvade Europe. And so he needed to keep this war going until he accomplished what he hoped to accomplish. We know now there's actually a really great series of books. It's one of the best. I recommend it to everybody, but it's really expensive.
Well, he was coordinating with the French underground, the French resistance, and he knew that America was entering the war. So like the idea that they would like establish a beachhead in France where they have friendly fighters is not an insane idea when you know like the largest industrial army currently on the field is sending an unimaginable number of troops across the Atlantic Ocean to help you. Like, it's not like it's a crazy idea that like you would reconnect with the French underground and like, you know, march north and east.
Now, and it's 6 long volumes called History of British Special Operations in the Second World War. And one of the books gets into the level of just the extent of media operations, propaganda operations, everything that they were running in the United States to eventually drag us into that war. And that was his whole plan. His whole plan was we don't have a way to fight this war ourselves. This war's over. We need either the Soviet Union.
Obviously, they couldn't fight the war themselves. It was a world war. A world war. Like, it spanned the world.
Union or the United States to do it for us, and that was the plan, and kept the war going long enough for that plan to come to fruition. And to me, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war. And
oh, it's a craven, ugly way to fight a war. Oh no! Was the war being fought in ways that were too cowardly for you? Oh, did that make it look too ugly? Was the war not pretty enough for you? It's a fucking war, dude. It's not just any war. It's a world war. It's the biggest war we've ever fought in the history of the planet. What are you not getting here? But the people who won, they did it in a really cowardly way. And like, I'm sorry. Some people come to win and not to look nice as they get mowed down like the Light Brigade.
What was the motive?
Well, you know, Churchill's got a long and complicated history. I mean, he's somebody who
that was the wryest smile I think I've ever seen.
Yeah. Well, look.
This guy really hates Winston Churchill because Churchill killed a lot of Nazis.
I think on one level, there was a sense that Churchill was sort of humiliated by his performance in the First World War as the head of the Admiralty, and he was out in the cold for a long time.
I mean, Gallipoli.
Yeah, and which, you know, that was his operation.
Yeah.
You know, and so he was rightly held responsible for that and seen as responsible for one of the great disasters that the British suffered during that war. And so I think part of it is probably kind of personal. You know, he wanted redemption. He wanted to go out there and like prove that he's the warlord that can go out there and fight this big war. Probably. I think part of it, I read about Churchill and he strikes me as a psychopath. But he's also a sort of, I mean, he was a drunk. He was very childish in strange ways. People would talk about how, as an adult, like as prime minister, they'd find him in his room and he's like playing with action figures like war toys and army men and stuff, and would get mad when people would interrupt him, you know, when he was doing this. This is a strange fellow, you know. There's all those things. But then you get into, you know, why was Winston Churchill such a dedicated booster of Zionism from early on in his life, right?
Probably because he was anti-Semitic. I don't know a whole lot about Churchill, but I do know a whole lot about European history of anti-Semitism because that was part of what I studied for my minor in history. And Yeah, Europeans were on another level of anti-Semitic. Anyway, to round out that segment, let's just go to the most replayed part of the podcast. We've gotten through most of it. You kind of get the angle he has here. Like, oh man, the British fought the Nazis, and that makes the British bad. You know, that's kind of his main angle here.
So if you change those stories, all of those things change as well.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue to something I'm just itching to talk to you about, itching to get your view on. And that leads us back to Churchill. So Churchill's this great hero, defender of the West, savior of the West, the toughest man in world history, the only reason we're not speaking German. And he won the Second World War. Like, that's what, ask anybody, that's just a fact. And yet, if I go to his country, like, regularly, and it's, it doesn't really even exist in any recognized way, it's totally degraded. I try not to go there.
Tucker Carlson is saying that England doesn't exist anymore because there are black and brown people there now.
Because it's so depressing. It's just so sad. It's so broken. It's not the country of victors. It's a completely defeated country that's subsequently been invaded. And so
the invasion is people from British colonies coming, like, moving to England. That's the issue. It's like he watched too much Alex Jones, and now he's trying to do a bad copy.
How did that happen? How did I go to Japan and it's full of self-respect and order and cleanliness, and, like, it doesn't look like it lost. It's like, what is that?
Well, I think we ran
again, and he's holding up Japan because that's what Nazis and white supremacists do. They hold up Japan and they're like, look at this pinnacle of civilization. And now look at all of these degraded and degenerate Western countries with their queer people and their not white people. And it's because they view Japan as an ethno-state. And they think it is a good example of, like, what the entire world could be if only all the other countries on the world were ethno-states.
We ran an experiment that tells us pretty well what that is. And we didn't know we were running the experiment at the time, but you had the Iron Curtain set up, and all the countries behind it that were not exposed to incessant American world order Western propaganda for 70 years, they don't have these same problems. You go to Hungary, even a place like Poland, which obviously the leadership class of any of these countries is, you always have to be suspicious of them because, they
even Romania, which, as you said, suffered more than most countries.
Yeah. And so, but those countries, like, they don't mind. Again, the tippy-top leadership class might be one thing, somebody went to the London School of Economics or something, but, like,
taking NATO money. Yeah.
The people have no problem saying, no, this is a country, this is Hungary, this is a country for Hungarians, this is a Christian country.
Yeah, if you go to Hungary, a dictatorship run by a Christian dictator. Yeah, it turns out if you go to the authoritarian country that is run with, like, a militaristic, iron fist, suddenly a lot of people will be very gung-ho about excluding others from their society. It's crazy. Every single video I've watched about Japan has some fucking asshole in the comments saying, see how orderly and clean they are? It's because they're culturally consistent. Yeah. It's just racist. It's racist dog whistling. And by the way, in case you're wondering where this goes from here, mass immigration in Europe is the next segment. The civil rights movement and BLM is the next one. Then the next one is Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump, because this show can't stop filleting dictators or wannabe dictators. And basically, it's the Nazi white supremacist talking points. It's brown people bad and gross and ruining the world. And then we have, this is how black and brown people are doing that in America with civil rights and BLM. And then you have, hey, aren't dictators pretty great? They could probably fix that somehow. Only to follow it up with Christianity, because, really what you need in order to ensure that a dictator is good, one of the good ones, they just got to be Christian. See, that is the primary concept, the primary selling point to these people about, like, theocratic authoritarianism, right? They want someone who is ordained by God, and if a dictator is just willing to say, yes, I will be bigoted in favor of Christians, I will be biased in favor of Christians, they all seal clap. They all seal clap about that, and therefore he could never do anything wrong. He's guided by God. But we're not going to watch any more clips. I just wanted to put the bow on it. I wanted to put the bow on the segment. We did that. Tucker Carlson's bad, and he's leaning into Nazism, and he's also just a bad version of Alex Jones.
Jack is going to town. All the viewers gather around. Twitch and YouTube is where she streams. All that content is bursting the seams. Politics, gaming, and plenty more. Her sense of fashion you'll adore. So grab your stuff and hop aboard. We're going straight to Jack's Discord.